Hi everyone, this screencast is the screencast of notes for the respiratory system. So let's start right off with why we need a respiratory system. Think about it. Why do we need to breathe in and breathe out? Well, because us and other animals need to get oxygen into our body. And remember, oxygen, its symbol is O2. So that's how I'm going to write it. And we need to breathe in oxygen, and we also need to get rid of that waste gas produced by our cells, which is carbon, CO2, dioxide. And the reason that we need oxygen and we release carbon dioxide is because there's a process called cellular respiration that happens in each and every one of our cells. And our cells take in oxygen and take in blood sugar, a blood sugar called glucose, and they bring them in to make energy for the cell. And in the process of making energy, carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct, and it's toxic in high concentrations in our body, so we have to get rid of it. So let's make a definition for cellular respiration. It's the process by which animals use oxygen, O2, and digested food molecules, and more specifically, a sugar called glucose. So glucose is the name of the sugar that our cells use for energy. Okay? So our glucose inside your cell is reacted with oxygen. And in the process, all the energy stored in that food, in that glucose molecule, is released so that the cell can do everything it needs to do to function, so that you can do everything that you need to do to function. So where does cellular respiration occur? Well, there's a little hint in the name. It occurs within the cells of your body. Every cell of your body has cellular respiration occurring in it, and it occurs in a very special part or organelle of a cell called a mitochondria. Now, I'm not going to test you on that name now, but when we do our cell unit, mitochondria is a name that we're going to spend a decent amount of time on. But that's where cellular respiration occurs. Happens in your cells. Cells take in oxygen and glucose to make energy, and in the process they release carbon dioxide as a waste product, and you got to get rid of it. And the way you release that from your body is by breathing it out. So how does the oxygen and the food molecules get into your cells, and how does the CO2 get out? Well, the process by which that occurs is called diffusion, and we mentioned that a couple of times in the circulatory stations. So maybe you've heard that, but diffusion by definition, it's a process by which substances, especially molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide and glucose, move from where there's a lot of those molecules. And in science, we don't say where there's a lot. Instead, we say from where there's a high concentration, meaning a lot of them in a small space, to a low concentration, meaning less in a given space. Okay? So The diagram below is just showing you this. So the yellow blobby thing in the middle is representing a cell. There's the nucleus, and the blue dots are representing oxygen molecules. So there's already some in your cell, but there's a lot more outside of your cell. There's a higher concentration outside. So the process of diffusion just happens naturally. So they're going to go from where there's a lot of them and just move to where there's fewer of them until we have an equal concentration inside the cell as we do outside of the cell. Okay? And the process by which carbon dioxide leaves is the same. There would be a lot of CO2 molecules inside the cell, fewer outside of the cell in the blood. And remember, what's outside of the cell is the blood, right? So they move from a higher to a lower concentration. So that's the process of diffusion, and that's how molecules get into and out of your cell for the process of cellular respiration. Okay. So how do animals actually get the oxygen they need for cellular respiration? Well, here I've got a picture of some invertebrates. So here we've got a mollusk. This guy looks like an ant. Here it looks like a grasshopper. And remember, mollusks live in the water, so it makes sense that they're going to obtain their oxygen from the water. So they draw the oxygen into their bodies. Some of that oxygen flows over these gill-like structures. So they're basically gills right here. They're called ctenidia, but we'll just call them sort of primitive gills. So they move over these gills. The water has more oxygen than what's inside of their cells. So the O2 just naturally diffuses in, and the CO2 diffuses out. So a grasshopper has little openings outside of its body along the side called spiracles, and oxygen diffuses into a grasshopper's body through these little openings called spiracles, and they go through this tracheal system, and then the oxygen flows into their body and CO2 flows out. Ants have kind of folded lung-like, it's like a comb. So these would be, I don't even want to call them lungs, but they kind of act like primitive lungs that look like combs that when air passes through, the oxygen just diffuses right in and CO2 diffuses out. Okay. So fairly primitive looking organs. Now we move up to vertebrates. Now, aquatic vertebrates, in other words, our fish friends, and a few other animals, obtain oxygen and release carbon dioxide through their gills. You know, if you were going to look at a gill up close, they have a lot of what we call surface area. So there's a lot of room for gas exchange. Oxygen goes in from where it's more highly concentrated in the water to where it's less concentrated on the inside of the gill. And CO2 moves from inside of the gill, where it's more highly concentration, out into the water. So then we move on to our vertebrates that live on land. You know, that's what terrestrial means. They live on land. And if you live on land, you don't have water continually passing over your lungs, so you have to develop another way to get your oxygen. And we do it, I guess, what you would call through breathing, where we draw in oxygen from the air and we force it down into these structures that I know you know are lungs, right? So as the animals get more advanced, the structure of their lung gets more advanced, and we've been seeing that all along with all the different systems that we've been studying. If you notice, The inside of the lungs for amphibians are fairly smooth. Reptiles are kind of more complex. And if you look carefully at the inside of a mammal lung, you'll see this little tube that air gets drawn down into. This is your trachea. It moves into bronchi, which are the pipes entering your lungs, into bronchioles, which are these little branches where the air is still traveling. And then these branches end in these little kind of lumpy sacs. So I'm going to take you down to the picture just below so you can see those sacs a little bit better, because I want you to know their name. Those sac structures are called alveoli, which is just a fancy name for air sacs that have a lot of tiny little blood vessels lining them. So within those alveoli, here you go, you take a breath, so you're bringing a whole lot of oxygen. So if I just draw a picture of the inside of just one, so all these little tiny air sacs, okay, here's just one air sac right here. So let's say you've just breathed, you're doing it right now, and you've increased the concentration of oxygen that's going inside of this air sac. Well, lining this air sac are lots of little tiny capillaries that have blood in them, right? So this blood will be oxygen poor, because it's just come back from your body. So the oxygen will diffuse into your blood cells through these capillaries where there's not a lot of oxygen, and these capillaries will release CO2 because there's a high concentration of it. So they release the CO2, and the CO2 gets released by you. So there's just your basic information about the respiratory system. At some of the other stations, you guys are going to learn about the parts of the respiratory system, and you're going to label the human respiratory system and learn a little bit more about cellular respiration and breathing. So this ends this video on cellular respiration.